Hi guys, welcome back to another video on the Sign of 4. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 7, the episode of the barrel. Just before we begin, another note just to be writing down these numbers, following these as we go through, making sure that you're ticking them off. So just really quickly then before we start, recapping Chapter 6. So in Chapter 6, we see Sherlock Holmes giving a demonstration of his detective skills. We see him working out where the murderers entered the room at Pondicherry Lodge to kill Bartholomew, where they exited. We get the boot print on the windowsill. We get the small footprints in the loft space, and the revelation that the villains have trodden in some creosote. Just to remind you, creosote is a kind of paint that you would use on wood. It's used to protect it from weather. It has a really very distinctive smell, and so in Chapter 6, Sherlock Holmes talks about hiring a dog to go and sort of trace the path of the creosote from the house to wherever the villains are now. That's what we're going to see in this chapter, the episode of The Barrel. In this chapter, we also get some of the relationship between Watson and Mary Morstan. We see that develop. We see some progression within that relationship. We also see a little bit of Holmes being a detective. Generally, there's not that much in this chapter. So even though it's a long one, hopefully this video shouldn't be so long, because as the chapter progresses, there's kind of less and less stuff for us to really get into. Okay, so let's begin. As ever, I'm going to talk through the video and then we will go through some of my annotation. Okay. The police had brought a cab with them, and in this I escorted Miss Morstan back to her home. Sorry, just to remind you, Watson has been told to take Miss Morstan back to her home. We looked at that right at the end of the last chapter. So I'll start again. The police had brought a cab with them, and in this I escorted Miss Morstan back to her home. After the angelic fashion of women, she had borne trouble with a calm face, as long as there was someone weaker than herself to support, and I had found her bright and placid by the side of the frightened housekeeper. In the cab, however, she first turned faint, and then burst into a passion of weeping. So sorely had she been tried by the adventures of the night. She has told me since that she thought me cold and distant upon that journey. She little guessed the struggle within my breast, or the effort of self-restraint which held me back. My sympathies and my love went out to her, even as my hand had in the garden. I felt that years of the conventionalities of life could not teach me to know her sweet, brave nature as had this one day of strange experiences. Yet there were two thoughts which sealed the words of affection upon my lips. She was weak and helpless, shaken in mind and nerve. It was to take her at a disadvantage to obtrude love upon her at such a time. Worse still, she was rich. If Holmes's researches were successful, she would be an heiress. Was it fair, was it honourable, that a half-pay surgeon should take such advantage of an intimacy which chance had brought about? Might she not look upon me as a mere vulgar fortune-seeker? I could not bear to risk that such a thought should cross her mind. This Agra treasure intervened like an impassable barrier between us. Okay, so we start with some more description of Mary Morstan. And this is a really good place to note the description of Mary Morstan, because it is so far now from the first time that we see her. I'm pretty sure as well this is the last time we'll see her before the end of the novel. So this is probably the middle point, and we will see her emotions kind of break a little bit here. But the religious imagery used, the angelic fashion of women, and this again talks about the perfect Victorian woman. And no, Watson is making quite a generalization about all women here. He's saying that women all are angelic. She had borne trouble with a calm face. Again, she's showing no emotion. Now this, as long as there was someone weaker than herself to support, I initially thought she was that Watson was talking about himself, which maybe at the beginning a bit, but here he's talking about Mrs. Bernstein. He's talking about the servant that Mary Morstan comforts. However, in the cab, Mary Morstan burst into a passion of weeping. This is quite a change in her character. This is the first time we really see Mary Morstan exhibiting any kind of emotion, despite the fact that she's looking into a case in which her father, she now knows, has died. I think this is quite telling. She's finally showing her emotion. I think it shows that she is more comfortable around Watson, that maybe some of Watson's feelings towards her are being reciprocated at last, because in this instance it's just Mary and Watson in the back of the taxi. Before, there'd been lots of other people there that might have judged her for her emotional outbursts, but here we see that she's perfectly willing to show emotion in front of Watson. I think that is a definite indication that their relationship is developing. And we have another, as I mentioned in the previous chapters, we have another nice little kind of fourth wall break-ish kind of reference from the present to the past that she has told me since. This indicates their relationship continues in some way past the events of the novel. Now we get some of Watson's feelings, that there was a struggle within his breast. There was a struggle in his heart. He was torn. That he was behaving with self-restraint, that he was trying to control his own emotions. But despite all of his coldness, his sympathies and love went out to her. So, he has a lot of feelings for her. Now, we come to this. The two thoughts which sealed the words of affection upon my lips. The two reasons why Watson doesn't feel able to confront Mary with his true feelings and with his true intentions. The first is that she is weak, helpless, shaken in mind. We could take those words as being, derogatory of women, and I think there is a little bit of that. But here he's talking about the fact that, she has been emotionally damaged by what has happened, by the events of this mystery, and he feels that if he were to confront her with his own feelings, he would be seen to be taking advantage of that situation, of Mary Morstan's raw emotional state. So that's the first reason. The second reason, and he says here, worse still, so something in his mind that is worse than a man taking advantage of a woman who is emotionally raw would be a man taking advantage of a woman who was richer than him. Worse still, she was rich. And this is at the heart of Watson and Mary's relationship. And I think this is at the heart of one of the big ideas that is explored within this novel. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But what Watson's saying is that he worries about class difference. He worries about the fact that he is lower middle class right now, and Mary Morstan right now, without the treasure, is lower middle class. They're kind of a similar class background. However, once she inherits all of this money, she's going to become upper class. She's going to become very, very rich. Now, Watson doesn't feel that someone from a lower class can be in a relationship with someone from an upper class. And this is a typical Victorian attitude. I'll do this now. So the Victorians, another aspect of Victorian fear was kind of class infiltration. The idea that the working class would somehow rise to the middle classes and ruin the fun for the middle classes. The same for the upper classes. The idea that the middle classes would rise up into the upper classes and ruin the upper classes' fun. We see this where workers in factories are looked over for promotion because bosses have friends who can become bosses, where the upper classes reject what they would call new money, people that have set up industry and own production. So, history is littered with these kinds of class situations. And I think here Conan Doyle is showing that he also agrees with the idea that classes should not mix. And it will be shown in other scenarios within this novel, but right here we see it through this reluctance of Watson to enter into a relationship with Mary Morstan. You know, he is saying the class system works, the class system is set up as it is to function, and if I challenge that by attempting to be in a relationship with someone above my class, then it's not going to work. There is an interesting caveat to that I will talk about when we finish the novel, but yeah. We also, he uses the word heiress, making us aware that Mary Morstan will become upper class and rich, and he describes himself as a half-pay surgeon. Middle class, okay for money mostly, but he's not rich. This rhetorical question: might she not look upon me as a mere vulgar fortune seeker? Might Mary Morstan not think that Watson was pursuing her because she was going to be rich? And finally, this Agra treasure intervened like an impassable barrier between us. Why? Why does Watson think that? Well, again, it all comes down to class. And particularly Watson feeling that someone from a lower class should not move up into a higher class. Let's cut that down. Good stuff. It was nearly 2 o'clock when we reached Mrs. Cecil Forrester's. The servants had retired hours ago, but Mrs. Forrester had been so interested by the strange message which Miss Morstan had received that she had sat up in the hope of her return. She opened the door herself, a middle-aged, graceful woman, and it gave me joy to see how tenderly her arm stole round the other's waist, and how motherly was the voice in which she greeted her. She was clearly no mere paid dependent, but an honoured friend. I was introduced, and Mrs. Forrester earnestly begged me to step in and tell her our adventures. I explained, however, the importance of my errand, and promised faithfully to call and report any progress which we might make with the case. As we drove away, I stole a glance back, and I still seemed to see that little group on the step, the two graceful, clinging figures, the half-open door, the hall light shining through stained glass, the barometer, and the bright stair rods. It was soothing to catch even that passing glimpse of a tranquil English home in the midst of the wild, dark business which had absorbed us. And the more I thought of what had happened, the wilder and darker it grew. I reviewed the whole extraordinary sequence of events as I rattled on through the silent, gaslit streets. There was the original problem. That, at least, was pretty clear now. The death of Captain Morstan, the sending of the pearls, the advertisement, the letter. We had light upon all those events. They had only led us, however, to a deeper and far more tragic mystery. The Indian treasure, the curious plan found among Morstan's baggage, the strange scene at Major Sholto's death, the rediscovery of the treasure immediately followed by the murder of the discovery, the very singular accompaniments of the crime. I'll stop there, I said. So before we continue, we get a little bit of an impression of Mary Morstan's life away from this mystery. We see that Mrs. Forrester, very interested by everything that's been happening. Also that she treats her tenderly, that she treats Mary Morstan motherly. This shows that Mary is respected in the house. Watson even goes on to say that she was clearly no mere paid dependent, but an honoured friend. Now this, I don't know, I wouldn't say that this was unusual, but definitely atypical that a servant or an employee of a household would be treated in this way. And particularly in Victorian fiction, we don't see very often house servants being treated respectfully, being treated as part of the family. And I think that Conan Doyle does it so that he can set up this very typical Victorian scene. This is all a typical Victorian scene. Graceful clinging figures, half-open door, hall light shining, stained glass, barometer, bright stair rods. These are all typical things that you would find in a Victorian house. Mary Morstan arriving, being greeted by an older woman, kind of motherly older woman. It gives you this image that was normal Victorian society. That was the normal things that were happening every day. And Watson juxtaposes that by describing the mystery and the case as wild, dark business. So this speaks directly to a Victorian audience, as a description of any home now would speak to you. So Conan Doyle is speaking directly to his audience. He's juxtaposing these two pieces of imagery, this typical Victorian scene with the idea that the case is wild and dark. I think that this helps to build mystery. It helps to build the idea that they are in abnormal territory. But also this. It kind of indicates that Watson wants to be back in normality. And it also shows how much he feels that the situation is strange. And then we have a plot recap. This is a fairly typical feature of a detective novel. So somewhere halfway through, a character will relay all the events that have happened so far, just to remind the audience of what's going on. So, remarkable weapons, the words upon the card corresponding with those upon Captain Morstan's chart. Here was indeed a labyrinth, in which a man less singularly endowed than my fellow lodger might well despair of ever finding the clue. Pinchin Lane was a row of shabby two-storied brick houses in the lower quarter of Lambeth. I had to knock for some time at number 3 before I could make my impression. At last, however, there was the glint of a candle behind the blind, and a face looked out at the upper window. "Go on, you drunken vagabond," said the face. "If you kick up any more row, I'll open the kennels and let out 43 dogs upon you." "If you'll let one out, it's just what I have come for," said I. "Go on," yelled the voice. "So help me gracious, I have a whipper in the bag, and I'll drop it on your head if you don't hook it." "But I want a dog," I cried. "I won't be argued with," shouted Mr. Sherman. "Now stand clear, for when I say 3, down goes the wiper." "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," I began, but the words had a most magical effect, for the window instantly slammed down, and within a minute the door was unbarred and open. Mr. Sherman was a lanky, lean old man with stooping shoulders, a stringy neck, and blue-tinted glasses. "A friend of Mr. Sherlock is always welcome," said he. "Step in, sir. Keep clear of the badger, for he bites. Ah, naughty, naughty, would you take a nip at the gentleman?" This to a stoat, which thrust its wicked head and red eyes between the bars of its cage. Okay, so just a little reference to some of the imagery that is used here. So Watson describes the case as a labyrinth. This is a metaphor. Now, a labyrinth is a difficult maze to solve. You may also recollect this from the Greek mythology work you might have done in Year 7, with reference to a minotaur at the centre of the labyrinth. You know, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a stretch, although they do use this metaphor a couple of times. But maybe the minotaur is Jonathan Small. You know, he kind of has that a kind of aggressive, unthinking characteristic to him. So maybe we'll see that when we get to Jonathan Small. Now he refers to Holmes as being a man. So if a man less singly endowed than my fellow lodger wouldn't be able to solve the case, so he describes Holmes as being observant, and that he can find a clue anywhere. Now, we get some impression of the working class. This Mr. Sherman is definitely a representative of the working class. He lives in a property where he holds animals. When the police need some of those animals, they might go to him and get some. So, for the area that he lives in, he shouts at Watson, "Go on, you drunken vagabond." So he assumes Watson is a drunk to be there at that hour. You know, it's quite late at night. So maybe that shows that Mr. Sherman lives in a rough area. He uses threats of violence to get what he wants, to kind of get Watson to go away. Again, this might show Conan Doyle's belief in what the working class attitude would be. You know, this idea that the working class people of the time, they mostly just resort to violence, maybe. Just a little note, the wiper, that was a spelling mistake. It should be a viper. But here again, we get a little bit of working class dialect. "Anne, I'll drop it on your head if you don't hook it." So a nice little sort of idiom there at the end. Go away. The fact that he is rude and aggressive, he's shouting at Watson. This again might link to the ideas of working class people, and particularly what Conan Doyle's attitude towards working class people was. Here they're presented as rude, impatient, violent, aggressive, all of those things. However, when Watson uses Sherlock Holmes's name, the words had a most magical effect. This metaphor showing that Holmes's name is like a code. I've talked already about how Sherlock Holmes is great at everything. Well, here we see that Sherlock Holmes is able to establish and develop relationships with working class people. Because when Watson talks about Sherlock Holmes, Mr. Sherman just lets him in. He stops being aggressive and all of that. So again, I think this is showing Holmes as brilliant at another thing. Then we get a little description of Sherman: lanky, lean old man, stooping shoulders, stringy neck, blue tinted glasses. Yeah, lanky and lean, maybe, we could talk about poverty there. But again, this shows that Holmes has friends at all levels of society, lower, middle and upper class. He's able to talk and kind of be friendly with people from the entire class spectrum. A friend of Mr. Sherlock's is always welcome. Yeah, okay, we've kind of done that. So that's it's only a slow worm. It ain't got no fangs, so I gives it the run of the room, for it keeps the beetles down. You must not mind my being just a little short with you, at first, for I'm guided by the children, and there's many a one just comes down this lane to knock me up. What was it that Mr. Sherlock Holmes wanted, sir? You wanted a dog of yours? Ah, that would be Toby. Yes, Toby was his name. Toby lives at number 7 on the left there. He moved slowly forward with his candle among the queer animal family which he had gathered round him. In the uncertain shadowy light I could see dimly that there were glancing, glimmering eyes peeping down at us from every cranny and corner. Even the rafters above our heads were lined by solemn fowls, who lazily shifted their weight from one leg to the other as our voices disturbed their slumbers. Toby proved to be an ugly, long-haired, lop-eared creature, half spaniel and half lurcher, brown and white in colour, with a very clumsy waddling gait. It accepted after some hesitation a lump of sugar which the old naturalist handed to me, and, having thus sealed an alliance, it followed me to the cab, and made no difficulties about accompanying me. It had just struck 3 on the palace clock when I found myself back once more at Pondicherry Lodge. The ex-prize fighter McMurdo had, I found, been arrested as an accessory, and both he and Mr. Sholto had been marched off to the station. 2 constables guarded the narrow gate, but they allowed me to pass with the dog on my mentioning the detective's name. Holmes was standing on the doorstep with his hands in his pockets, smoking his pipe. Okay, so, yeah, here again we have, just at the top, with Mr. Sherman, we have more of his dialect, the working class dialect. It hain't got no fangs, so I gives it the run of the room, for it keeps the beetles down, and so on and so on. And this, here we have, I'm guided out by the children. That's just that he's bullied by the children. Now, this is the introductory of Toby as a character. Toby's kind of going to feature in this chapter quite a bit, but we get some setting and so some of the setting in which Toby lives. He's then described as kind of like a mongrel. He's got long hair, lop-eared, half spaniel, half lurcher, brown and white. He's not your typical bloodhound. He's not your typical animal that you would expect a police officer to use. This, I think, shows that Holmes is able to overlook appearances, that he really is after skill sets rather than what is typical. And as we find out, and as he's already said, Holmes trusts Toby. He believes that he is a really useful animal. We then see, it's just struck 3 on the palace clock. That's 3 in the morning. This is just keeping the narrative up, showing the linear nature of this element of the story. And then we have more treatment by police. McMurdo has been arrested as an accessory. So this shows that Athelney Jones is really gunning for arresting Sholto and kind of trying to frame him for the crime. Okay. Ah, you have him there, said he. Good dog, then. Athelney Jones has gone. We have had an immense display of energy since you left. He has arrested not only friend Thaddeus, but the gatekeeper, the housekeeper, and the Indian servant. We have the place to ourselves, but for a sergeant upstairs. Leave the dog here and come up. We tied Toby to the hall table and reascended the stairs. The room was as he had left it, save that a sheet had been draped over the central figure. A weary-looking police sergeant reclined in the corner. "Lend me your bullseye, sergeant," said my companion. "Now, tie this bit of card round my neck, so as to hang it in front of me. Thank you. Now I must kick off my boots and stockings. Just you carry them down with you, Watson. I'm going to do a little climbing and dip my handkerchief into the creosote. That will do. Now, come up into the garret with me for a moment." We clambered up through the hole. Holmes turned his light once more upon the footsteps in the dust. "I wish you particularly to notice these footmarks," he said. "Do you observe anything noteworthy about them?" "They belong," I said, "to a child or a small woman. Apart from their size, though, is there nothing else? They appear to be much as other footmarks." "Not at all. Look here. This is the print of a right foot in the dust. Now I make one with my naked foot beside it. What is the chief difference?" "Your toes are all cramped together. The other print has each toe distinctly divided." "Quite so. That is the point. Bear that in mind. Now would you kindly step over to that flap window and smell the edge of the woodwork?" Okay. So this is the idea with Athelney Jones. At the beginning of this page, we're getting a little bit more of attitude towards the police, and this is the idea that the more people Athelney Jones arrests, the more it looks like he did a good job. But does he have the right man? That is the question. And just returning to the idea of the attitude towards the police and the difference between Holmes and the police, I think this comes down to that pretty demonstration versus pretty business. Athelney Jones, treating this like a business, he just needs to get a guy, he needs to get an arrest. The more people that he arrests, the more likely it is he's going to get someone that will confess or make something up or just be fooled into confessing for something. So, this is more attitude towards the police. This statement here is ironic that Holmes describes Jones as showing an immense display of energy. We know that Athelney Jones is not particularly healthy, that he's not an energetic kind of guy. He's breathless just from walking up the stairs to get to the room in Pondicherry Lodge. So that's irony and a little bit of sarcasm there. The idea as well that Jones only works hard when he is arresting people. Jones isn't interested in clues and evidence. He's just interested in results. Okay. So, sorry about this, guys. More than attitude towards the police, the idea that the sergeant in the room who's supposed to be guarding this murder crime scene is just weary looking and reclined in the corner. This policeman is not on the job. However, Holmes and Watson have been doing this all night and they are still on the job. So this is more difference between Holmes and the police. Okay, here Holmes is described as physically able and agile. He's going to do some climbing, all of this kind of stuff. Not much to get into it. Now, here we're going to return to Holmes's 3-step plan. Observation, deduction, knowledge. Holmes is presenting Watson with some observation. The idea that these footprints, the toes are all separate, but Holmes's footprints, the toes are all bunched up. That is what he observes. So let's continue. So I shall stay here as I have with this handkerchief. Yeah, I shall stay here as I have this handkerchief in my hand. Sorry about that. I did as he directed and was instantly conscious of a strong, tarry smell. That is where he put his foot in getting out. If you can trace him, I should think that Toby will have no difficulty. Now, run downstairs, loose the dog, and look out for Blondin. By the time that I got into the grounds, Sherlock Holmes was on the roof, and I could see him like an enormous glowworm crawling very slowly along the ridge. I lost sight of him behind a stack of chimneys, but he presently reappeared and then vanished once more upon the opposite side. There, when I made my way round there, I found him seated at one of the corner eaves. "That you, Watson?" he cried. Yes, this is the place. What is that black thing down there? A water barrel. Top on it? Yes. No sign of a ladder? No. Confound the fellow. It's a most breakneck place. I ought to be able to come down where he could climb up. The water pipe feels pretty firm. Here goes anyhow. There was a scuffling of feet, and the lantern began to come steadily down the side of the wall. Then with a light spring he came onto the barrel, and from there to the earth. It was easy to follow him, he said, drawing on his stockings and boots. Okay, let's just stop there a second. Not much to go on here. So just a real quick reference, because I'm a bit of a geek for this sort of stuff. Blondin. He talks about Blondin. This is a reference to a guy called Charles Blondin, who was a famous tightrope walker in the Victorian era. So when Holmes tells Watson to look out for Blondin, Holmes is saying that he is Blondin, which is a metaphor to mean that Holmes is attempting a dangerous feat of walking really high up. This is it's maybe a cultural reference from the Victorian era. This simile, like an enormous glowworm crawling very slowly along the ridge, this just shows that Holmes is capable of doing dangerous things. Now, so the tiles were loosened the whole way. We'll just deal with that before we move on. So here is some observation. He observes that the tiles are loosened. The deduction means he must have climbed the pipe and walked up the roof. If the tiles are loosened, if you observe the tiles are loosened, you have to deduce that something has loosened those tiles. That must be the person that's been up there climbing about on the roof. And in his hurry, he had dropped this. It confirms my diagnosis, as you doctors express it. The object which he held up to me was a small pocket or pouch woven out of coloured grasses and with a few tawdry beads strung round it. In shape and size, it was not unlike a cigarette case. Inside were half a dozen spines of dark wood, sharp at one end and rounded at the other, like that which he had struck Bartholomew Sholto. They are hellish things, said he. Look out that you don't prick yourself. I'm delighted to have them, for the chances are that they are all he has. There is the less fear of you or me finding one in our skin before long. I would sooner face a martini bullet myself. Are you game for a 6-mile trudge, Watson? Certainly, I answered. Your leg will stand it? Oh, yes. Here you are, doggy. Good old Toby. Smell it, Toby, smell it. He pushed the creosote handkerchief under the dog's nose, while the creature stood with its fluffy legs separated, and with a most comical cock to its head, like a connoisseur sniffing the bouquet of a famous vintage. Holmes then threw the handkerchief to a distance, fastened a stout cord to the mongrel's collar, and led him to the foot of the water barrel. The creature instantly broke into a succession of high, tremulous yelps, and, with his nose to the ground and his tail in the air, pattered off upon the trail at a pace which strained his leash and kept us at the top of our speed. The east had been gradually whitening, and we could now see some distance in the cold grey light. The square, massive house with its black... Okay, well, I'll get onto that in a second, actually. So, this, we have more then coming out about this Victorian fear to do with colonial indigenous people attacking and killing Western white people. The description of the pouch, the small pocket or pouch woven out of coloured grasses, this gives the whole thing quite an exotic feel. The fact that Watson describes it as being covered in tawdry beads, showing that he believed, the case had no value. The half-dozen spines of dark wood, the fact that there were six of these darts, the fact that Tonga had in his power the ability to murder 6 people, that's all linking in with the Victorian fear. The use of religious imagery here. They are hellish things. This is the second time, second or third time we're seeing Holmes using this religious imagery to show how distressing and scary the situation really is. Before he says, there is something devilish in this, Watson. Here, they are hellish things to describe the darts from the blowgun. He then goes on to compare them to bullets. He talks here that I would sooner face a martini bullet myself. Now, a martini bullet was from a rifle called the Martini Henry. This was a very big, dangerous rifle, widely used by colonialists, so widely used in the colonies. And is this Conan Doyle kind of subconsciously presenting that kind of struggle. So you have the colonialists with their blow darts. Sorry, you have the indigenous people with their blow darts, the colonialists with their Martini Henry rifles. Both are being seen as just as deadly. And again, this talks directly to the Victorian audience. They will be aware of all of these things. So then we get Toby following the trail. We're going to see quite a bit of that coming on. Yeah. So just to finish this page, the east had been gradually whitening, and we could see now some distance in the cold grey light. The square massive house with its black empty windows. I'll continue this in a moment. Let's just go through this imagery. The east had been gradually whitening, so dawn. This is light taking over the darkness. In the evening, things had been difficult and a struggle, and they found lots of scary, mysterious occurrences. The death of Bartholomew Sholto, the very small footprints, all of these things. Even you could say the arresting of Thaddeus Sholto. These are dark things, but now symbolically, dawn is rising. Light is coming. This could be the light of justice. This could be the light of reason. But, we could say that there is a somewhat turning point in the narrative here. And then we get the final description of the house, and it maintains this Gothic horror nature. The square, massive house with its black, empty windows and high, bare walls. This builds on that image of a Gothic mansion with ghosts and ghouls and things within it. Let's carry on. Towered up, sad and forlorn behind us. I will just finish about the house, actually. So Watson adds romanticism by personifying the house. And think about here, how does the description of the house change? It goes from being this imposing, dark figure to being this sad, forlorn figure. Why is the house sad or forlorn? Is it the events that have happened within it? Is it the destruction that has happened around it, because of Thaddeus and Bartholomew's greed? Is it those things? Our course led right across the grounds, in and out among the trenches and pits with which they were scarred and intersected. The whole place, with its scattered dirt heaps and ill-grown shrubs, had a blighted, ill-omened look which harmonised with the black tragedy which hung over it. On reaching the boundary wall, Toby ran along, whining eagerly, underneath its shadow, and stopped finally in a corner screened by a young beech. Where the two walls joined, several bricks had been loosened, and the crevices left were worn down and rounded upon the lower side, as though they had frequently been used as a ladder. Holmes climbed up, and taking the dog from me, he dropped it over upon the other side. There's the print of wooden legs' hand, he remarked, as I mounted up beside him. You see the slight smudge of blood upon the white plaster? What a lucky thing it is that we have had no very heavy rain since yesterday. The scent will lie upon the road in spite of their 8 hours start. I confess that I had my doubts myself when I reflected upon the great traffic which had passed along the London road in the interval. My fears were soon appeased, however. Toby never hesitated or swerved, but waddled on in his peculiar rolling fashion. Clearly, the pungent smell of the creosote rose high above all other contending scents. Do not imagine, said Holmes, that I depend for my success in this case upon the mere chance of one of these fellows having put his foot in the chemical. I have knowledge now which would enable me to trace them in many different ways. Let's stop there. So we see some of the destruction here. So the trenches and pits with which they were scarred and intersected. So the idea that this beautiful house and the beautiful grounds had been torn apart by Thaddeus and Bartholomew. The house had a blighted, ill-omened look, which harmonised with the black tragedy which hung over it. So this idea that the house looks tragic, that the house has been the scene of a black tragedy, as in the death of Bartholomew Sholto. Personally, I think that you could look at this a couple of ways. You could think about, the house being metaphorically sad at the damage that has fallen on it, or you could use this as an exploration of the hollowness of wealth, and that is another big theme within this novel. Bartholomew and Thaddeus have this fantastic house. They've inherited it off of their father. They've got all of these grounds, all of this wealth, all of this money, but rather than just sitting back and enjoying the things that they have, they destroy parts of the things that they have in the pursuit to more money, to more wealth. And that greed only leads them to breaking something that is of value. So you have to look at their attitude towards the treasure as being an exploration of the hollowness of wealth and the hollowness of greed. Okay. So Toby ran along whining eagerly. Yes, so Toby again is chasing the treasure down. Here. Now it's just occurred to me, with Holmes, you have this duality regarding his detection. He's very interested in new ways, but he's also very interested in old ways. And certainly using dogs to trace people and track people down is a very, very old-fashioned detective skill. However, Holmes doesn't need the skills of Toby. He's being quite arrogant here. We may even describe this as hubris, a word which means overconfidence. Usually hubris leads to some sort of fall, to some sort of loss. But here, Holmes is definitely being very overconfident. He says that I have knowledge now which would enable me to trace them in many different ways. So Holmes doesn't believe that he needs the skills of Toby. He's kind of maybe doing it to try and get to the hideout quicker than if he could trace them otherwise. But the hubris thing, pride that comes before a fall, we will see that Holmes will struggle to solve this case. He's not quite as good as he thinks. Okay. So this, however, is the readiest, and since fortune has put it into our hands, I should be culpable if I neglected it. It has, however, prevented the case from becoming the pretty little intellectual problem which it at one time promised to be. There might have been some credit to be gained out of it, but for this too palpable clue. There is credit, and to spare, said I. I assure you, Holmes, that I marvel at the means by which you obtain your results in this case, even more than I did in the Jefferson Hope murder. The thing seems to me to be deeper and more inexplicable. How, for example, could you describe with such confidence the wooden-legged man? Pshaw, my dear boy, it was simplicity itself. I don't wish to be theatrical. It is all patent and above board. Two officers who are in command of a convict guard learn an important secret as to buried treasure. A map is drawn for them by an Englishman named Jonathan Small. You remember that we saw the name upon the chart in Captain Mawson's possession. He had signed it in on behalf of himself and his associates. The sign of the four, as he somewhat dramatically called it. Aided by this chart, the officers, or one of them, gets the treasure and brings it to England, leaving, we will suppose, some condition under which he received it unfulfilled. Now then, why did not Jonathan Small get the treasure himself? The answer is obvious. The chart is dated at a time when Morstan was brought into close association with convicts. Jonathan Small did not get the treasure because he and his associates were themselves convicts and could not get away. But that is mere speculation, said I. It is more than that. It is the only hypothesis which covers the facts. Okay, let's just go through this. So we see here a little bit as well, more to do with that hubris and that overconfidence. Holmes is disappointed that the whole case can be solved easily. He believes that if they hadn't got the clue from the creosote, that this whole case could have been a real intellectual problem, but because they happen to have found this one clue that's going to lead them straight to the killers, it's all academic, really. This isn't going to be a very complex case at all now. And yeah, Holmes is feeling the whole thing is just too easy. However, Watson still can't understand. This is more difference between Holmes and Watson. We've talked about quite a lot of these. We've talked about this one specifically already, so you should be seeing now, this is the difference. I marvel at the means by which you obtain your results. Watson is hugely impressed by the way that Holmes is able to get his results, because he finds the situation deeper and more inexplicable. He still can't understand what's going on. We now get, again, observation, deduction, knowledge. And I've tried to break it down here. So he observes there are 2 officers of convict guard. He observes there is a map drawn with the sign of 4 on it. He observes that one officer has brought treasure to England. So the deduction is that the guards are guards of convicts. So Jonathan Small must be a convict, which explains why he doesn't have the treasure. You know, if Jonathan Small hadn't been a convict, he could have just gone and got the treasure himself. The knowledge shows that the date on the map was when Sholto worked in prison. Therefore, Sholto must have met Jonathan Small while working in prison. Okay, we're going to do some more of them. Let me just close this one. So let us see how it fits in with the sequel. Major Sholto remains at peace for some years, happy in the possession of his treasure. Then he receives a letter from India which gives him a great fright. What was that? A letter to say that the men whom he had wronged had been set free, or had escaped. That is much more likely, for he would have known what their term of imprisonment was. It would not have been a surprise to him. What does he do then? He guards himself against a wooden-legged man. A white man, mark you, for he mistakes a white tradesman for him, and actually fires a pistol at him. Now only one white man's name is on that chart. The others are Hindus or Mohammedans. There is no other white man. Therefore, we may say with confidence that the wooden-legged man is identical with Jonathan Small. Does the reasoning strike you as being faulty? No, it is clear and concise. Well now, let us put ourselves in the place of Jonathan Small. Let us look at it from his point of view. He comes to England with the double idea of regaining what he would consider to be his rights, and of having his revenge upon the man who had wronged him. He found out where Sholto lived, and very possibly he established communications with someone inside the house. There is this butler, Lal Rao, whom we have not seen. Mrs. Bernstein gives him far from a good character. Small could not find out, however, where the treasure was hid, for no one ever knew save the Major and one faithful servant who had died. Suddenly, Small learns that the Major is on his deathbed. In a frenzy, lest the secret of the treasure die with him, he runs the gauntlet of the guards. Yeah, we'll stop there a second. Just to say, here again, when Holmes talks about things that cover all the facts, this is eliminate the impossible and whatever is left must be the truth. So, further observation and deduction. Holmes has observed here that Major Sholto fired a pistol at a white tradesman. Therefore, he deduces that Jonathan Small, the person who's after him, that the person who's after him must be Jonathan Small, as Jonathan Small is a white person's name. As he mentions here, there's only one white man's name on the chart. So he deduces that Jonathan Small must be the person that is after Major Sholto. We get some of Jonathan Small's motivation, or at least Sherlock Holmes interpreting Jonathan Small's motivation. The idea that Jonathan Small is here to get the treasure back, and that he's going to get his revenge upon the man that has wronged him. Now again, if we're thinking about class a little bit, about underclass, convict class, sub-working class, Holmes's interpretation is revenge and financial wealth. He's saying here that maybe that's what the working classes are all about. Let's just continue. So he makes his way to the dying man's window and is only deterred from entering by the presence of his 2 sons. Mad with hate, however, against the dead man, he enters the room that night, searches his private papers in the hope of discovering some memorandum relating to the treasure, and finally leaves a memento of his visit in the short inscription upon the card. He had doubtless planned beforehand that should he slay the Major, he would leave some such record upon the body as a sign that it was not a common murder, but from the point of view of the four associates, something in the nature of an act of justice. Whimsical and bizarre conceits of this kind are common enough in the annals of crime, and usually afford valuable indications as to the criminal. Do you follow all this? Very clearly. Now, what could Jonathan Small do? He could only continue to keep a secret watch upon the efforts made to find the treasure. Possibly he leaves England and only comes back at intervals. Then comes the discovery of the garret, and he is instantly informed of it. We again trace the presence of some confederate in the household. Jonathan, with his wooden leg, is utterly unable to reach the lofty room of Bartholomew Sholto. He takes with him, however, a rather curious associate, who gets over this difficulty, but dips his naked foot into creosote, whence comes Toby, and a 6-mile limp for a half-pay officer with a damaged tendo Achilles. But it was the associate, not Jonathan, who committed the crime. Quite so, and rather to Jonathan's disgust, to judge by the way he stamped about when he got into the room. He bore no grudge against Bartholomew Sholto, and would have preferred if he could have been simply bound and gagged. Okay, so again we're thinking about observation, deduction, knowledge to work out all this information about Jonathan Small. Just a little descriptor here, mad with hate, talks about Jonathan Small and his vengeance. That Jonathan Small leaves a memento, the card. Think a little bit about, why does Jonathan Small do this? What does this show about his character? Would that be the action of somebody who didn't want to get caught? Would that be the action of somebody working independently to leave a calling card at a scene of a crime? Also, why does Jonathan Small want people to know who it was that was involved with the murder? And I think that all of this links to the idea of honour and the fact that Jonathan Small is, to some extent, an honourable character. Holmes finds the idea of this silly, though. He describes it as whimsical and bizarre. Holmes sees this from the point of view as a criminal. Why would you leave clues on purpose? And bear in mind, if Jonathan Small hadn't left any of these clues, then it probably would have been quite difficult for Sherlock Holmes to have determined any of this information out. So, yeah. Okay, so we again trace the presence of some confederate in the household. Holmes believes that somebody was betraying Bartholomew Sholto. And here's a nice reference that kind of links Holmes and Watson now. So Watson previously has talked about being a half-pay surgeon with a bagged leg, and now here we have Holmes referring to himself as a half-pay officer with a damaged tendo Achilles. So this is Holmes identifying with Watson, and in the same way that we have the pretty demonstration and the pretty business, here we have the half-pay surgeon with a bad knee and the half-pay officer with a damaged tendo Achilles. Please try to remember these quotation kind of pairs. If Holmes and Watson comes up in the exam, that's a nice one to remember. If difference between Holmes and Athelney Jones comes up in the exam, the other pair is a nice one to remember. So please try to remember these quote pairings. The damaged tendo Achilles, this is another reference. Well, this is a reference to Watson's war wound. Holmes is trying to identify with that too. But there is also some symbolism in there. The Achilles heel. What is Holmes's Achilles heel? Is it drugs? Is it solving crimes? Is it detection? If his Achilles heel has been damaged, then maybe he feels part of his weaknesses are on show. So now, rather to Jonathan's disgust, the judge, by the way he stamped about the room, went, okay, so this shows that Jonathan Small didn't want anybody killed. As well as being honourable to some extent with the sign of 4 notes, this shows that, he is relatively peaceful towards people that aren't his enemies, towards people that he doesn't have vengeance on. So, just to say, that Jonathan Small would have preferred if Bartholomew Sholto could have simply been bound and gagged, that Jonathan Small did have some criminal intentions when entering the room. Now, he did not wish to put his head in a halter. There was no help for it, however. The savage instincts of his companion had broken out, and the poison had done its work, so Jonathan Small left his record, lowered the treasure box to the ground, and followed it himself. That was the train of events as far as I can decipher them. Of course, as to his personal appearance, he must be middle-aged, and must be sunburned after serving his time in such an oven as the Andamans. His height is readily calculated from the length of his stride, and we know that he was bearded. His hairiness was the one point which impressed itself upon Thaddeus Sholto when he saw him at the window. I don't know that there is anything else. The associate? Ah, well, there is no great mystery in that, but you will know all about it soon enough. How sweet the morning air is! See how that one little cloud floats like a pink feather from some gigantic flamingo. Now the red rim of the sun pushes itself over the London cloud bank. It shines on a good many folk, but on none, I dare bet, who are on a stranger errand than you and I. How small we feel with our petty ambitions and strivings in the presence of the great elemental forces of nature. Ah, you are well up in your Jean-Paul. Fairly so. I worked back to him through Carlyle. That was like following the brook to the parent lake. He makes one curious but profound remark. It is that the chief proof of man's real greatness lies in his perception of his own smallness. It argues, you see, a power of comparison and of appreciation which is in itself a proof of nobility. There is much food for thought in Richter. You have not a pistol, have you? Okay, so lots of things. We're just going to talk through them now. So this to put his head in a halter, that is a euphemism to mean to be hung. Jonathan Small understands the consequences of his actions. He understands that if he murders someone and is caught for it, he will be executed. That is something that Tonga doesn't understand. And again, when we get to Tonga, you could use that as a comparison of indigenous and colonialist people, their different attitudes, that Tonga doesn't have the same kind of morality and sense of justice. Like Jonathan Small understands the justice system. Holmes describes Tonga as well as having savage instincts to show that he's cruel, beastly, but it's instinct. You can't help it, kind of like an animal. We get some observation and deduction about Jonathan Small. The observation is that Jonathan Small served as a convict in the Andamans, so he must be sunburned. The observation that he was a prisoner a long time ago, so the deduction is he must be middle-aged. Here, Holmes withholds some information about Tonga, about this strange associate. Why? Why does Holmes withhold details of the story from Watson? It is to increase tension, isn't it? A mystery. Bear in mind, Watson is the narrator and everything is filtered through him. So if Holmes gives him the story bit by bit, then the story is structured nicely. So here, more of this transformation, from night to day, the weather has turned and the fog has now gone. Holmes remarks to the clouds, the little clouds floating in the sky, the sun pushing itself over the London cloud bank. The idea that, this is the beginning of a new day, a different day, where things are going to be a little bit easier. How small we feel with our petty ambitions and strivings in the presence of the great elemental forces of nature. This is kind of a philosophical argument. And we also have the little pun, small, thrown in there, reference to Jonathan Small. Holmes here showing that he believes that man is insignificant when compared to nature, that man is nothing in the face of nature, that nature is the biggest force in the universe, and it is to an extent. Jean-Paul, this is Johann Paul Friedrich Richter. He was a romantic writer who believed in nature and humanity. This is another literary reference. It is the chief proof of man's real greatness lies in his perception of his own smallness. This idea that man is great because he understands how small he is in the universe. This again is a very Victorian attitude. And it's an attitude that prevails today. It's an attitude that many people still have, that individually we are all insignificant. that together we make a society which is stronger. But in this instance, Holmes is talking about how a great thing that human being can do is realise that they are only one part to a bigger machine. And in doing so, I think Holmes means to relinquish some of your own ambition a little here. However, we also have the pun. The chief proof of man's real greatness lies in his perception of his own smallness. Jonathan Small again. And could Holmes be saying here that the chief proof of man's real greatness lies in his perception of his own smallness? That Jonathan Small is Holmes's own smallness, and the chief proof of Holmes's greatness lies in his ability to perceive Jonathan Small, to understand Jonathan Small without even meeting him, which, if you think about everything that's happened in this chapter so far, is exactly what Sherlock Holmes is doing. So there's a lot wrapped up into this fairly throwaway sentence, but we have the overarching philosophical argument that, we are all insignificant. We have the humorous pun around the name of Jonathan Small, and we have some of Sherlock Holmes's arrogance coming out into it. Yeah. Okay, last page. Sorry. Oh, what's going on? Okay, I have my stick. It is just possible that we may need something of the sort if we get into their lair. Jonathan and I shall leave you to it, but if the other turns nasty, I shall shoot him dead. He took out his revolver as he spoke, and having loaded 2 of the chambers, he put it back into the right-hand pocket of his jacket. We had during this time been following the guidance of Toby down the half-rural, villa-lined roads which led to the metropolis. Now, however, we were beginning to come along continuous streets where labourers and dockmen were already astir, and slatternly women were taking down shutters and brushing doorsteps. At the square-topped corner public houses, business was just beginning, and rough-looking men were emerging, rubbing their sleeves across their beards after their morning wet. Strange dogs sauntered up and stared wonderingly at us as we passed, but our inimitable Toby looked neither to the right nor to the left, but trotted onwards with his nose to the ground and an occasional eager whine which spoke of a hot scent. We had traversed Streatham, Brixton, Camberwell, and now found ourselves in Kennington Lane, having borne away through the side streets of the east of the Oval. The men whom we pursued seemed to have taken a curiously zigzag road, with the idea probably of escaping observation. They had never kept to the main road if a parallel side street would serve them their turn. At the foot of Kennington Lane they had edged away to the left through Bond Street and Miles Street, where the latter street turns into Knight's Place. Toby ceased to advance, but began to run backwards and forwards with one ear cocked and the other drooping, the very picture of canine indecision. Okay, just to go through a few little bits on this page. So lair, the fact that they talk about where Jonathan Small and Tonga are based is a lair. This links with the idea of evil, monsters, maybe couples up with the reference to Labyrinth earlier. The readiness for violence, Holmes saying he's going to shoot someone dead if it all goes a little bit south. We also see here Holmes is so confident he only loads 2 shots. He literally has got a revolver with probably at a minimum 6 chambers, and Holmes loads 2 bullets. There are 2 enemies, 2 bullets, which might talk about Holmes being a master shot. He is pretty good at shooting later on. We then get some references to working class people, labourers and dockmen already astir, and slatternly women taking down shutters and brushing doorsteps. Rough-looking men emerging, rubbing sleeves across their beards after their morning wet. These are all working class people getting ready to start their day. Labourers, dockmen, women who are running households or small businesses, men drinking beer, having a first beer of the day before starting any work. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is just the general attitude towards alcohol at the time. The second, sanitation and drinking water. The water that you would get from pumps in London at this time would have been very, very dirty. So people often took to drinking very weak beer to kind of try and compensate for the lack of water they were getting. Toby is shown to be really on his game. It is following the scent really closely. Toby, it's a little bit of a comparison to Holmes. In particular, the bloodhound thing that we see earlier on, the reference from Watson in the previous chapter. Toby here now, he becomes confused. He cocks one ear, runs one way, runs another way. He's unsure of which direction to take. And this foreshadows Holmes' own issues with the case to come. Showing, potentially in the future, Holmes is also going to struggle with this case. Okay. Then he waddled round in circles, looking up to us from time to time, as if to ask for sympathy in his embarrassment. "What the deuce is the matter with the dog?" growled Holmes. "They surely would not take a cab, or go off in a balloon." "Perhaps they stood here for some time," I suggested. "Ah, it's all right. He's off again," said my companion in a tone of relief. He was indeed off, but after sniffing round again, he suddenly made up his mind and darted away with an energy and determination such as he had not yet shown before. The scent appeared to be much hotter than before, for he had not even to put his nose to the ground, but tugged at the leash and tried to break into a run. I could see by the gleam in Holmes's eye that he thought we were nearing the end of our journey. Our course now ran down 9 elms until we came to Broderick and Nelson's large timber yard, just past the White Eagle Tavern. Here the dog, frantic with excitement, turned down through the side gate into the enclosure where the sawyers were already at work. On the dog raced through sawdust and shavings, down an alley, round a passage, between 2 wood piles, and finally, with a triumphant yelp, sprang upon a large barrel which still stood upon the hand trolley on which it had been brought. With lolling tongue and blinking eyes, Toby stood upon the cask, looking from one to the other of us for some sign of appreciation. The staves of the barrel and the wheels of the trolley were smeared with a dark liquid, and the whole air was heavy with the smell of creosote. Sherlock Holmes and I looked blankly at each other, and then burst simultaneously into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. Alright, so just a few little things. Watson here personifies the dog as if he were a detective himself. He's saying here that the dog is embarrassed that he cannot get the case totally right. Holmes is shown as being excited. They pass a lumberyard with lots of creosote. And then, finally, Holmes and Watson react to the fact that Toby has taken them in completely the wrong direction. What's happened is Toby has taken them to a place where they use creosote all the time. It's obvious that what's happened is the scent of the murderers and the scent of a delivery truck have become crossed, and Toby has followed the one that's taken them back to the yard. But how are Holmes and Watson affected by coming to a dead end and running out of leads? When they burst into laughter, they aren't that concerned. And again, I think this is Holmes's confidence. It's Holmes's hubris. Watson doesn't know any better. Watson isn't aware of anything that is going on really, but Holmes should know better, and Holmes should be acting in a different way. But he's very, very overconfident, and as we'll see in the coming chapters, Holmes's overconfidence is a little poorly placed. He doesn't necessarily have these guys bang to rights. Okay, so that's chapter 7. Just work on these things in your workbooks. I want you to recap the details of the mystery up to this point, thinking about what has been solved, what is outstanding, so what hasn't been solved, and how does Holmes use observation, deduction, and knowledge. Please, if anything comes up about Sherlock Holmes, I want you to be able to really confidently talk about observation, deduction, and knowledge. This is a premise he establishes at the very beginning of the novel, and is a method that he uses time and time again. So please make sure you fully understand how Holmes is using observation, deduction, and knowledge. Okay, so that's us finished for chapter 7. Keep a lookout on Show My Homework. I'll get chapter 8 up as quick as possible. And thanks for listening, guys, and I will speak to you all again soon. Bye-bye.